kind of a conversation that started at a coffee shop. I think the same coffee shop for both of you. We both met Billy Joe's one night, and Cassandra Frazier and Michael Levinson and my name's Matthew Slats. I'm the executive director here at the Bridge. And it was just a really great conversation, hearing about the work that Cassandra's doing with the transduction course and that Michael's doing with the Institute for Humanities and Global Cultures. And so we were able to pull this event together, so I'm really excited to have everybody here. Just to give you a really brief. The Bridge is a socially engaged arts organization that really tries to push the boundaries of traditional art and also have a really big impact on the community. So we try to place artists in roles that rethink the city and then engage the city, people that live in the city to kind of think about the city in different ways. So like this project that here, Habitat City, which we're wrapping up this week, the Tom is a real great effort of that. So please, we're going to pass around a sign-in sheet, so please add your name and your email address. We'd love to keep in touch. But I'm going to turn it over to Sandra to get things started. So thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. Matthew kind of provided the context of this event tonight, provided us with a venue, and this is a collaboration between the Page Barber Transduction Project that I'm running, and he mentioned Michael Levinson, who's the English professor and the director of the Institute of Humanities and Global Cultures. And I should also mention we have an ongoing partnership with Open Grounds at UVA, and Lindsay Hepler is from Open Grounds. She's back there. She'll be videotaping the event tonight and the discussion. And they are about networking within the university, but also with the community. So we're happy to have all of these groups kind of collaborating, and all of you here for part of the discussion. And I just want to provide really brief context about the transduction project. I should mention there are probably about 15 students from this project, from the project team here, as well as others. And this word is kind of a strange word, and so we just want to explain it briefly first. So transductions are a process by which materials or devices and organisms convert one kind of energy or signal into another. And that maybe sounds a little bit technical, but a good example is a solar energy panel, where you have light energy being converted by the panel into electricity. And then a not so nice example might be how a toxic chemical serves as a chemical signal that maybe gets in our bodies and causes a negative sort of health outcome. So we've been looking at all different kinds of signals, and the reason we're looking at this is because it somehow seems that the way our kind of practical conception of the material world as kind of static, stable, bounded objects that aren't really connected so much seems sort of inadequate to help us understand the sustainability challenges that we're facing these days. And also, if we're thinking about the world in terms of the objects that we can see and we don't imagine their interactions, we sort of are missing a framework that helps us understand the digital revolution as well, because there's sort of wireless signals. Many of the signals that are affecting us these days are invisible, so chemicals or electronic signals and wireless signals and things of that nature. So the Transduction Project is an attempt to provide a framework that's big enough to capture the sustainability topics as well as the digital media revolution that we're experiencing now. So this event is very much an important theme in that discussion, both because it addresses sort of the thrill of all these new technologies and what they're enabling for us, but also raises some questions of how are we affected by our use of these technologies? How is it affecting learning, community, and our brains? And so we're very grateful to have three excellent panelists here tonight, and also Michael to moderate. And I'll turn it over to Michael, and thank all of you for coming as well.
Hi everyone. So we have a can't fail event because the subject's so interesting. So we did a good thing out this evening. It's going to be good to talk together. I want to thank Cassandra. She's thanking everybody else, but she's the one. She had the idea. She pitched it. It seemed irresistible immediately. And you know how it is. You have an idea and you talk, and then suddenly it's real. So it's real right now. I have the pleasure of being here with three interesting people, and I also get the chance to moderate the conversation. So I'm just going to identify very quickly the three clever individuals who are stepping forward this evening. Jim Coan is professor in the Department of Psychology. He's on the board, too, of the Center on Contemplative Sciences. His work moves in many directions: the social regulation of emotion, the neuroscience of affect, the nature of attachment, all issues that have to do with the gadgets that we're going to be engaging this evening. Amanda French is well known to me. She was a doctoral student in the Department of English and has recently been up at George Mason in the Rosenzweig Center for History and New Media. She's been coordinator for that camp. I love to read what she writes. She writes in the new media, about the new media, so very powerfully, and I love to listen to her. Angeline Lillard, also from the Department of Psychology. The center of her work is the study of play, pretended play, the work of fantasy. She has a big study, such a decisive study of Montessori. Montessori, the science behind the genius. And so questions of mental development and the role of fantasy are crucial to her thinking, but will be crucial to what we think about tonight together. So we'll have the panelists, and Cassandra, is this the best idea to have them talk in order of the alphabet, or did you have another thought? Let's do that then. And just before we begin, it would be great for us to get some sense of who you are. You don't have to say your names, there's too many of you for that. But how about who's from the University of Virginia coming over here? So who's not from the University of Virginia? So that's about a 1/3, 2/3 conversation. And with that, that's actually an occasion to thank Matthew again, because this is called The Bridge, but one of the things that he does so instinctively and well is to live up to that title. So for me, it's just a source of constant frustration that we're inside this university, inside this walled garden, and we do so little to get out into the community. This is our Humanities Week, and it was just key to our planning that we get outside of the University of Virginia and move through space a little bit. So I'm so glad that you took the trouble to come down. So what we'll do, how about this panel? Jim, you'll come up first and talk, and then Amanda, you'll wait and join then, and Angeline then, and then we'll have a moderated conversation for all of us. So welcome, Jim Coan.
Just to get it clear, 10 minutes or so?
That sounds good.
Okay, and maybe somebody will throw up a sign when there's 5 minutes. Okay, thank you. I want to start out, first of all, thank you for the invitation to speak about this. This is a really exciting opportunity for me to have this conversation with everybody. I want to start out talking about a little bit about my work and then speculate a little bit about what it might mean for this conversation. My work concerns sort of the social regulation of individuals in social networks, how people regulate each other in various ways and for various reasons. And it starts out with a story of how the brain creates a sense of self. It turns out the brain, the self is something that the brain does. It's not something that the brain has, and the self is very malleable. When you try to nail down exactly what the self is in the brain, it's not so easy to do. It turns out to be a little bit changeable from day to day, week to week, context to context. One of the things that we've learned is that a way to define how we understand familiarity, especially with regard to other people, is that individuals who become familiar, that sense of familiarity that we have, that we take so for granted, is the brain mapping the familiar person onto the self. And so the distinction between self and others starts to break down when you start really to understand how brains regard others and regard the self and create sort of neural and psychological constructs of self and others. That's very esoteric and strange. What does that have to do with any of this? Well, there are some really interesting consequences of that modeling of the self. And one of them has to do with the way humans have evolved to utilize social networks. It turns out we are brilliant outsourcers of psychological processing. We outsource thought. We outsource feeling. We outsource memory. And here's how it works. In a series of experiments that we've done using some brain imaging and many other devices and approaches, we found that when people are engaged in coping with an emotional challenge or a threat, that proximity to someone that they know and love decreases how their brain responds to certain aspects of that threat. It decreases the perception of the threat as, in fact, threatening. Okay? And one of the reasons that this happens is because, as I said earlier, this distinction between self and other that breaks down as people become familiar. One of the tricks that the brain uses to decide how to intervene in our environment is it utilizes that other that again has been mapped onto the self. It interprets that other, because it's been mapped onto the self, as the self. Its resources, that other person's resources, are my resources, and that is interpreted as a bioenergetic resource, which is very interesting because not only now do we find that if I'm potentially threatened, but my friend or loved one is with me, that means that the threat is distributed between us and we have more resources to deal with the threat, so there's less work that I have to do in coping with it, so I will work less hard, commensurately. My colleague Denny Crockett, also in psychology here, has observed that this extends to basic perception. One of the things that we know happens if we're standing at the bottom of a hill is that we perceive the hill as steeper than it actually is. One of the things that you should all understand is that perception is a controlled hallucination process. We don't actually perceive reality very, very clearly. We run operations on it with our brain to make the best guesses about how to use it. So we perceive hills as steeper than they are because our brain is trying to say, don't walk up the hill, save your energy. Right? It turns out that if our good friend is standing right next to us, the steepness of the hill goes down because we have more energy. We're free to spend more energy. Okay? One of the other things that's been widely documented is that humans distribute autobiographical memories to their social networks. So part of the way that I remember my own life is by being with my wife, or my sister, or my mother, or my father, or my brother, or my best friend. These individuals carry the story of my life. Okay? And this is not poetry, it's sort of poetic, but it's not poetry or metaphor, it's literally the case, right down to the metabolic demand on things like glucose and oxygen in their brains versus mine. We distribute not only memories, we distribute the cost of maintaining those memories. And that is the key to understanding why all of this works evolutionarily. Because one of the things that nature requires is for us to spend as little as possible to get as much as possible. Okay? So this is an adaptation. It's an innovation. The humans are mainly unique as animals because we have learned to extricate ourselves from a specific terrestrial environment. We are not bound by any specific climate or our terrestrial formation or even diet, temperature. We are not bound by these things because we have developed the ability to turn and face each other and create an ecology that is social and carry that social ecology anywhere we go. We've been to the moon, we've been to the bottom of the ocean. We can go anywhere because we are not bound to a terrestrial environment, we're bound to each other, but we are bound to each other. And we're bound to each other because of this innovation of distributing and outsourcing. Now what I would like to suggest is that with these new devices that we're seeing, the internet, the rise of these very powerful gadgets, as they're called, has a very interesting relationship with our brain's natural inclination to outsource thought. To outsource thought, memory, emotion, and so on. That on the one hand, we've created a social ecology. Talk about transduction. One of the ways that we become each other through this modulation of the self and how the self gets represented neurally is through very subtle communication, facial expressions, lots of very complex language. We can communicate very efficiently, and that allows us, again, to distribute all of this thought and processing of emotion and perception across these social networks. The gadgets are, on the one hand, taking advantage, after all things go viral, of this capability that humans have. It's taking advantage of our natural inclination to be what one of my colleagues calls information DJs. First thing we want to do when we hear something important is tell all the people in our social networks. It gets distributed. That has a number of effects. There's a lot of things I could say about that in a whole other talk, but one of the effects is that it gets it a little bit out of our own heads. It distributes the cost of carrying that information. Okay? So in that sense, these gadgets are taking advantage of us. They're sort of, we're fertile ecological ground for them to thrive on. But on the other hand, we are utilizing these things so effectively. They're taking advantage of our ecological niche, if you will, precisely because we are designed root and branch as animals to outsource psychological, mental, neurophysiological effort. We are prepared to do that. We do that better than any other animal. That's why we took over the planet, because it's a very, very powerful innovation evolutionarily. And so now we have Google. I don't remember a lot of things because I have Google. And that makes great sense from a certain perspective because I get to conserve that energy and I get to conserve glucose in my brain, to conserve oxygen by outsourcing to Google. When I distribute problems to, it gets more concrete though. Facebook. We share stories all the time, but what we're doing is setting up those social networks. What happens with those social networks? Many things. We can get advertised to very, very efficiently. But also, when it's 3 a.m. and my wife is sick and I'm sick and I have a very sick kid, I can put a little note on Facebook and boom! I've got 25 people wondering if there's anything they can do. That's how people work. And in that sense, we're now in sort of a hyperactive version of ourselves. It's not very different from ourselves.
Thanks. Amanda French.
I have a question for you. Please, how many of you think that the book will exist in 50 years? Most everybody. Do we have any naysayers? I'm so glad you think so too, because I agree as well. I'm glad we all think that the book will exist in 50 years. It's a little bit of a trick question though, because you have to think about what we mean when we say book. I want to talk a little bit about the rise of the e-book reader today. We're talking about gadgets, devices, and I wanted specifically to talk about a particular device, which is the e-book reader. Could you forget that little photo? Web page in the browser. So speaking of vices, I would say that probably my biggest vice at the moment is Kindle books. I've got so many Kindle books. I've got about 900. I know there are many people who have more than that. And recently, Amazon gave people a settlement because of the recent lawsuit about collusion among large publishers for ebook pricing. And I had bought so many books that fell into this class that I was given $83 in free credit from Amazon. I think most people, usually you get these class action settlements and they're like for $4.84. So I've been enjoying my $80 Amazon credits. It is a vice, but it's a very mild vice. And it's a mild vice because even though I buy more ebooks than I should, and even though I buy them almost exclusively from Amazon because I have a Kindle and I'm a Kindle user and an Amazon Prime member and all of that, it's an affordable vice for me. Very often I will pay $4.99 for a book, an ebook, or $9.99, much more likely $12.99, rather than go to the library and get it. Now, I'm so sort of addicted to my Kindle ebook reader right now that it's sometimes easy for me to, it's hard for me to remember when I didn't have such a thing as an ebook reader, or the ability to read ebooks on things like tablets. But it's very, very recent, this rise of the ebook reader as a mainstream popular device. It's really only in the last 2 or 3, I think The New York Times first started counting ebook sales in its New York Times bestseller list in 2011. That's 3 years ago. Up until then, ebooks were not considered books by the New York Times bestsellers list. But now, if you look at the statistics, which I don't have on hand, but trust me, it's a hockey stick of ebook sales versus print book sales, particularly in the categories of fiction and sort of popular fiction and popular nonfiction as well, business books, self-help books, that kind of thing. Huge hockey stick from ebooks over print books. So the ebook reader as a mainstream adopted device is huge. It's arguably as big as the iPhone. It's increasingly being a fragmented market in the sense that people can read ebooks on other devices now, tablet devices such as iPads or Kindles. But the ebook reader itself is actually a very old idea. So this picture, which you can't see very well, could you maybe flip over to this as well? Oh, I think we're not going to be able to see it. The other image right there. Yeah. Okay, so here you can see. You can see the corrugated cardboard right here. This is a 1968 mock-up of an ebook reader, modeled, by the way, on learning theories of Jerome Bruner and Seymour Papert. This was done by Alan Kay, who was at Xerox PARC, which was the birth of the sort of the mouse and the graphical user interface and all of that. This is in a marvelous exhibit at computerhistory.org about the history of the rise of handheld computing. So if you go back to this other picture right here, sorry to make you my picture monkey, but this cardboard mock-up looks amazingly like a Kindle. It's got a keyboard, it's got a screen. The technology in 1968 was not there. The internet would not be invented for another year. The ability for computers to talk to one another really arose in 1969. And e-books would take only another 3 years, really, to be invented. So I don't know how many of you know about Project Gutenberg. It's still there, gutenberg.org. Project Gutenberg has e-books of a sense. Not e-books in the sense that we're used to, in the sense of something you can download to your Kindle, although you can get formats at gutenberg.org now that you can do on your Kindle. But gutenberg.org, the first Gutenberg book, was actually posted in 1971. It was the Declaration of Independence. I've forgotten the man's name, John something, who began the Gutenberg project. But he said, what use is this of computers talking to each other? Oh, I know, we can share books. We can share long-form texts more easily. So even before the rise of the web in 1992-93, there were electronic books being shared. This is one of the most popular uses of the internet. So the web comes out in 1992-93. The graphical interface to networked computers becomes, as we all know, hugely popular throughout the 90s. But it really takes, at least 10, really, closer to 15 years for something that we would recognize as an e-book to become really mainstream. And the e-book becomes mainstream because of the e-book reader, and primarily because of Amazon. The main point about this is not the only e-book prototype that predates the Kindle. There are many, many attempts to do e-book readers between 1968 and the release of the Kindle. I actually remember when I was in graduate school here at UVA, we did a pilot project with Microsoft, which had an early e-book reader. This must have been in the late 90s. And Microsoft wanted to do some market research to see how will this e-book reader work. So they took some bibliography students who were students of the book as a physical object and issued them all with e-book readers and filled those e-book readers with things like the entire run of Studies in Bibliography, which is a journal that's published here at UVA, and analyzed them and asked them questions. And it was only marginally successful. That e-book reader certainly no longer exists. But it's just really interesting historically to analyze why the Kindle in particular became the amazing force it is. So I won't go into that history right now because I want to keep the remark short. What I do want to say two things. The first thing is that every device that we have, every gadget that we have, is infused with the symbolism of the future. And it's deliberately infused with that symbolism by the companies that make those devices. Sometimes, when we look at retro technology, it's funny. It's the World's Fair, 1950s vision of the future, and we're only able to see that hilarious futurology from a historical perspective. Studying history of devices helps you understand that the devices that we have today are not always going to be the future. Someday they're going to be the past. And that helps us think about what to do in the present. So as I said, my first point is study the history of devices. Whether you're a fan of these devices or whether you're not a fan of them, it is really worthwhile to study the history of them. No innovation ever happens without understanding what has come before. The second point that I wanted to make is that I think often when we talk about our gadgets and our devices, we don't mean just the device. We mean all of the things you can do with the device. It's metonymic, it's synecdochal, it's, when you're looking at your phone, you're not literally looking at your phone. You're looking at the things that are in the phone or on the phone. You're looking at your Facebook, your social media. You're looking at the content that your phone enables you to access. Similarly, I think with ebook readers and just the ability to read ebooks on these various devices, it's clearly not the device that is the problem. What's clearly a problem, to the extent that there is a problem, are the policies around these devices. So that's what I want to talk about. And those are humanly created, historically contingent, and still changeable. So, people were nodding when I talked about the Amazon lawsuit for ebook price collusion among some of the big publishers. Some people might worry about the demise of the large publishers because of excessive monopoly by Amazon over ebooks in particular. I don't worry about that. It doesn't bother me if the big 6 publishers go under. What I worry about is the survival of the book. And what I'm also worried about a little bit with the rise of the e-reader is the survival of the library, specifically the public library. Right now, the Copyright Office is calling for comment on a proposed policy about whether publishers should enable ebooks to be borrowed, to be bought by public libraries and lent and borrowed. As you may know, public libraries in general have only been around for a little bit over 100 years. Really, the public library in the United States as we know it is in many ways the invention of a not necessarily completely admirable guy, Andrew Carnegie, right? Enormous philanthropist, enormous robber baron of the late 19th century. He believed very strongly in the democratization of knowledge. And so what Carnegie did was to say, all right, libraries helped me. My access to someone's private library, meaning just a collection of books, helped me become the extremely wealthy, successful railroad tycoon that I am today. I think that everyone should have that opportunity. So I'm going to partner with communities to found public libraries in those communities. And the way this would work was he would say, I will build you the building of the library and give you a lot of startup costs if you will commit to sustaining that library over the course of many decades, many years. And that worked very well. And now we can't imagine such a thing as not having public libraries. People have said, and I agree, if you tried to get the idea of a library passed today, it would never pass. The notion that it's a socialist notion, it's a communist notion, my God, all these books that are available for free. Print books can be bought by libraries on the same basis that everybody buys a print book, and then they can be loaned out. That is not true right now for ebooks. Public libraries have managed to work around this. You can get the Overdrive app. There are very, very limited types of ebook lending. If you do any research in the University of Virginia Library Catalog, you may have the misfortune to come across things like NetLibrary, which are not really ebooks in a way that I understand them either. They're not convenient, this kind of thing. But right now, the Copyright Office is trying to decide, should we require that ebooks be usable by public libraries? I say yes. What do you say?
Yes.
Yes. That's all I have.
Angeline, if you would. Thank you.
Very interesting set of comments here. So, thinking about this, I'm going to return to some of the issues that Jim brought up with regard to what it is that these devices, and device, it comes from David or tool. What is it that these tools are doing with our minds? And several years ago, our old colleague, the late great Dan Wagner, was commenting to me that he couldn't believe that I didn't have a GPS. And I actually went around and, sort of joking, I said, oh, I still use my hippocampus. but it really is true. Dan went on to do research showing that if you know that you are able to access a computer, you don't remember things as well. And if you prime people by putting some computer cords, maybe not the case today with so much more wireless, in front of them, they're just not going to bring things up in their memory as well. And I've experienced that when I'm trying to remember something and the computer's right there, I have to walk in the other room in order to wake up those memories. So, these devices, they are good tools. They let us traverse time and space. They get us connected to each other and connected to sources of knowledge that are out there. They do work for us. They calculate things. They help us to remember things. They organize us. And then they entertain us. Lots of entertainment comes through them. But they really do change our brains. A very good philosophical discussion of this is Andy Clark has a book called Supersizing the Mind that gets to a lot of these issues. Or Nicholas Carr's book, The Shallows, is really interesting on how it is that we're thinking in shorter and shorter segments, and we're getting more and more distracted through having these kinds of technologies. What I think the technologies do is they amplify what we already are and what we already are going to do. So, for example, they'll amplify tendencies to isolate ourselves. When you see people walking around with their headphones on, or you might see a family having dinner at a restaurant and everybody's watching their own movie rather than conversing with each other. So that's amplifying isolation, but they also amplify our connection. And Jim gave the example of putting something on Facebook and suddenly you're connected to everybody. One of my daughters was in Uganda last year, and we're able to Skype and we're able to actually converse on a regular basis compared to when I was in college and it was an aerogram and it took 2 weeks to get there. So tremendous changes that way. But often going along with tendencies that people already have. And Lori McComey, who used to be in our department, showed that it was children who were already the most social who had the most friends on Facebook. So they're sort of doing what they were going to do anyways in this amplified way. But I want to talk about this all from a child development perspective. So 2 of my areas of research, pretend play, which is probably my biggest one in Montessori, came up, but I also have a line of research on the media. And in particular, I want to talk about the influence on children's attention of the media. And people, it's important to know, have always been really concerned when some new media comes in. So back around 1900, people were really worried about books. They were really worried about people reading. They were thinking it was making children sick to sit there and read. They weren't in the present moment. It was a bad and dangerous thing. Of course, we don't feel that way anymore. I have a textbook for child development from about 1947, and there's a chapter on comic book addiction. Big worry in the 1940s that your children will become addicted to reading comic books. And then it wasn't too much later, the television came along. And television concerns continue, and there are really 2 lines of concern about TV. One is, going back to good old Marshall McLuhan, where the medium is the message. So the TV itself is the problem. And there's actually very little research suggesting that the medium itself is the problem. Children who watch more television, particularly girls, are more likely to be obese, and that may be because they're sitting and watching TV, so there's kind of a time displacement issue. What else would you be doing if you weren't watching TV? But the second thing, and the thing that has really helped forth with concern about television and children, and this comes up with devices, by the way, since they're getting TV now through so many devices, so is content. You know, what is it that they're getting through it? And content is definitely a concern. There's good content. You know, children might learn vocabulary words and the like through television. They might learn some Spanish from watching Dora the Explorer. But there's a lot of negative content. People have been worried for a long time about aggression on television, and it's definitely been shown in an experimental way that children watching aggression on television are more likely to be aggressive themselves. Same goes for social aggression with girls. Also, children who watch television tend to be more gender stereotyped than other children. They're getting those messages from the TV. They tend to think that everybody is wealthier and happier than they actually are, so the social comparison gets thrown. Facebook does the same thing with college students. And children are more materialistic when they watch more television. They see all this stuff, and then they want all that stuff. So there are these negatives. And then the research that I've been doing recently has been looking at the influence on children's attention and their ability to pay attention in a sustained fashion. And others had found that when children have watched more television when they're, say, under 5, 6 years of age, they're more likely to have problems paying attention as they get older, so ADHD types of problems. And what we had found in our research, we started with a study showing that after watching just 9 minutes of SpongeBob SquarePants, children's executive function significantly declined. And we've gone on to find that it happens with other shows that are sort of fast and fantastical like that as well. Even ones that are designed to be educational, like Martha Speaks, designed to teach vocabulary, even Little Einsteins, which is actually slow but fantastical. So it seems to be something about needing to process really quickly these unrealistic, and actually even when it's slow processing, these unrealistic events that children are consuming again and again and again on these devices really around the clock. So those are some concerns that I have. Now, I said always over history people have been concerned about the new devices. You always wonder, is it different this time? And in part with young children, it's the time displacement issue. So to what extent are they watching these shows and engaging with these devices instead of doing the things that we know help children's development, which is interacting with other human beings, being able to read their facial expressions, being able to hear their tone of voice, and learning to communicate with others.
So if you two would come back, Jim and Amanda, and yeah, I think you all agree there's a lot interesting to talk about. So it's up to you now, and just start with questions. Yeah, I think the perspectives they converge to an extent, but they diverge too. So I think there could be a lot to talk about. So yes, please.
I had a question for Jim Coan. So you were saying how sharing your information will kind of allocate the energy expenditure of your body, right?
It can.
Yeah, it can. So when you're giving the example of how you were sharing emails and how that would potentially relieve stress, would that be applied in the same sense of Facebook and you're updating a status? But what if you weren't getting any kind of recognition for that? What if no one was noticing that your status? Would that still have the same effect?
Stress you out.
Okay, so
That's something people report all the time.
yeah.
I mean, Angel said, I think we're all pretty much in agreement that a lot of what happens with these media is an extension and an intensification of what happens in our we go, our ordinary non-device-laden lives. So even in our social networks, that long before there were any of these devices, there were ample opportunities for failed bids for social contact that were stressful.
Before we go to the next question, let me just ask the three of you. I should have done that at the start. Is there anything you want to ask one another before we turn that to the next one?
No, but I wish I meant to emphasize more strongly, and particularly listening to her remarks, want to take the opportunity to emphasize now that books are, I think, the prototypical sustained attention technology, right? And by books, I mean long-form prose. So certainly when we all agree, and I agree, that books are not going to go away in 50 years, we mean that long-form prose is not going to go away, and that there will be people, maybe not as many people as we like, but there will be people to read and appreciate that long-form prose, no matter what device we're using to access it. So,
But is that a consoling thought? Books won't go away, we all agree, so we're safe. There will be long-form attention, because the other emphasis in your talk is that there are things we have to do. We have to worry about the library. So how do you bring those together?
So the way I often think about it is that I think about it in terms of theater. The fact that theater didn't go away in the age of the moving picture, right? What it did do was lose a lot of cultural capital. And I think that there was an age, maybe we're still in it, maybe we're not, when books had a great deal of cultural capital. They'll never go away completely, but they, I think now, even now, some people say we're moving to an oral culture. Again, I'm not sure I agree, and it's not necessarily a bad thing, because as you say, it's the content, not the medium. I think that if you have something really smart to say and you film yourself saying it and put it on YouTube, why is that so much worse than having something really smart to say and writing it down and publishing it? Unless your goal is to teach people to read and write, in which case, you should probably do a lot of reading and writing. So I think that books may lose some cultural capital, but won't quite.
For me, one of the issues there, though, is everything that's on that device that I have is just so ignorable because it's off and on. It doesn't have a physical presence in a way that a book does. I feel like a book is solid and it stays there, whereas that YouTube video, you just sort of shut it out. Something else replaces it always on the screen in a physical sense.
But that's why some people are really into theater, I mean, like, there's community theater, and of course there's Broadway, and, high schools still do school plays and things like that. And there are some people who absolutely say the same thing in the theater, that the live presence is...
But that's a question, I think, for you, Jim, too, because you're talking about a social network that is in large measure virtual in many of the examples you give. You put out the word on Facebook. Does it also have to have a real, material, physical, social presence as well?
Well, that's a really interesting question, and there's a kind of a technical side to the answer that hasn't really been fully fleshed out yet, but that I think is really important for the principle that I was talking about, for why we do all of these things, that we conserve effort, right? Conserve effort. And one of the reasons we know that is by looking in the brain, doing some of our brain imaging studies. We can look at what kinds of neural systems are mediating those efforts. And as it happens, there's a little bit of it's not quite a debate, because we all sort of know now, and it was a debate for about a nanosecond, but about how the brain mediates social support, for example. If I'm scared or I'm trying to remember something and you help me do it, how does my brain take that help that you're providing and tell the other parts of my brain to quiet down, settle down? It turns out that there's a big difference between physical presence and technological mediation of that social support. And the presence is an important one because it has everything to do with a part of the brain called the prefrontal cortex. It turns out that the prefrontal cortex, for a lot of reasons, not literally having to do with burning glucose, but opportunity costs, other kinds of things, the prefrontal cortex does a lot of stuff. But because it does a lot of stuff, it's a precious resource, and in that sense, we regard it sort of colloquially as expensive. It's an expensive piece of neural real estate. We try to conserve it when we can. It's a target of conservation. And one of the things that happens when we support each other in each other's physical presence, and especially with touch, is the impact on my emotional responding is not mediated through the prefrontal cortex. And that's really important because when I'm regulating myself, when I'm telling myself something like, this is only a movie, this is not real, I'm using my prefrontal cortex to do that, and that's expensive. So if someone else can regulate me, I realize a real savings. Turns out if we show a digital image of your loved one, you're still getting prefrontal mediation. It's like a self-regulation aid, but it's not, it's still a little more costly than the physical presence, having someone nearby. And that cost is really interesting because I think we experience that subjectively, many of us, as part of why we don't want to sit and look at pictures of our most loved ones. We want to go and see them. We want to be with them. You know, you had Skype with your daughter, but wouldn't you prefer to have your daughter? Maybe not always. But yeah, so there are gradations of these things, but the fact is that when it's not the physical person, we have to condition to it. When we have to condition to it, we have to understand that it's mediated through a piece of technology. We require more effort to make it. It's a simple transformation. It's a very simple transformation, but in the aggregate, over the long term, it probably starts to really matter. So that's part data, part speculation, because we know that the different media have these different effects on how our brain regulates itself, but we don't really know what the long-term consequences of those different. We can only speculate. It's a long answer, sorry.
That's great. Yeah.
I have a question about the virtue and vice part of this. I'm a sociology grad student, and I'm interested in the kind of the way that people use everyday critiques of technology and other people's use of technology to make meaning and moral order in their lives. And so I'm really hoping I can get you guys to talk about, you sort of mentioned the virtue and vice stuff offhand in each of your presentations, but I want to get you guys to talk about that part of your individual streams of research.
I mean, I think it feels to me like we're creating new virtues and vices in a way, right? But maybe they're not quite so new, because as you were mentioning, this notion of being mediated.
The lights or something.
Projector.
Projector, I guess. Thanks.
Sorry.
Sorry.
The debate about whether we're having authentic interactions or not is, as old as Plato and Plato's Cave, which is a fabulous technological parable if you read it in a certain way. And people cite over and over again Plato quoting Socrates saying writing itself will make you not be able to remember things, which is true. You write it down and that way you remember it.
I might say it helps you.
It helps you to not remember, exactly. It's not necessarily a bad thing. But I absolutely agree that you see more and more of this discourse around judging other people or judging yourself for being overly mediated in particular, for spending too much time on your phone, spending not enough time with other people, that kind of thing. So I don't know what to say about that except that I definitely see that as a phenomenon. I personally think that it winds up being just on a personal level, it winds up being a kind of a pragmatic set of strategies for not going too far down the road of vice and keeping yourself on the road of virtue. And I mean, cars, is an analogy, right? Before the invention of the car, we didn't have to worry about how to, whether your 16-year-old was okay to get behind the wheel. It's horrible that we allow that. 16-year-olds should not be allowed to drive, and yet they are. And I think the same is true for technology. It's all about kind of setting boundaries for your loved ones and yourself.
So Heather, do you want to engage the virtue vice question, or do you want to use it?
I think, new technologies come in and we need to figure out how to negotiate them. And it is so captivating to look at your phone and hear somebody calling and have them come in. One of the shuddering graphs that I saw in the newspaper in the last couple of years was children, the rate at which children have been being brought into emergency rooms for accidents, exactly paralleling the line of iPhone ownership. So, as you know, as the implication is parents are distracted and children are getting hurt at the same rate. I think, you know, children really do need attention, and parents being consumed by devices aren't giving that attention. But likewise, as children grow up and they want to be with their friends instead of their parents, that comes in at the dinner table also. And so, you know, as a culture, we want to be thoughtful about what it is that we're doing and what the effects may be. And I think it takes time for us to work these issues out.
You know, if I could just say something on that real quickly. When I started graduate school 20 years ago, one of the things that I was taught almost right away was to get a fair number of current up-to-date reference books so I didn't have to remember so much. So I could spend my time thinking about other stuff rather than always trying to keep these stuff in mind. And it's exactly analogous to how I use many, Google Scholar, for example, today. I went through a brief phase where I was downloading PDFs, PDFs of articles, original articles, so I could store them and reference them and use EndNote to make sure they're all organized. And I don't bother with that anymore. The internet stores all the PDFs, and they're always there. I don't know why or how, or I'm not a technician.
Librarians.
Librarians. Thank God for them. So I store that stuff. I let that stuff be out there, and so I don't have to worry about it. I don't have to keep a shelf packed full, sagging down with giant, old articles, probably most of which I won't read, because if I can find them with a quick search, very efficiently.
But the way that you read them's different. When I had to go to the library with my pocket full of quarters and find that journal and copy that article, I read it in a way that I don't read it.
I don't know. I mean, I think that's an empirical question, but I also think there's some romance in the way that we all do, because I did that too. And when I think about it and I think back about it, I think, wow, that was, I was a real scholar then. These students today, but I'm not sure. I'm really not sure, and I feel something in my gut going, wait a minute. Whenever I start, I start feeling that temptation to be the waggy finger of.
Yeah, I mean, a good way to empirically look at it would be miscitation. Is miscitation getting more common because people don't really carefully read the articles?
I'll just say, I wonder if the whole urgency around virtue and vice that you all came out tonight isn't in some ways a good sign. I don't know any student, I don't know any child that I deal with who isn't worried about their own use of the gadgets. And in a sense, I think we're becoming self-conscious about that. It's not that we're simply blindly using. Users are also self-conscious about their use, and I think that's an interesting turn in the history. Cassandra.
I was just going to just briefly say that when we were framing this, we were thinking about putting addiction in the title, and so we're wondering, is there something sort of inherently, addictive? I mean, when we had the discussions with students ahead of time and everything, we were thinking about, how this is reframing social interactions, and also people were trying to control their addiction to different kinds of use of.
There is evidence of real addiction with some of these devices that we report, but there's also evidence of habituation. So, for example, in small kids who are given unfettered access, sometimes they will habituate to the device and not be as interested in it as kids who are given intermittent access. And with a little bit of reflection on how behavioral principles, it sort of becomes obvious why that should be, because if you have an intermittent reinforcement, the reinforcement is more powerful. So even at the level of addiction, it seems to look a little bit like other things that are potentially addictive but aren't lawfully addictive.
I'm a Waldorf early educator, so sort of Montessori with a lot more of that. But my question, I guess, an observation is, I think that the transition into this new stage, it's different than when we transitioned into, say, having a book, is the work you all do. Because now we have research, and we can really see the impact as opposed to speculating. And I'm interested in how much you think, you're looking at this Skype image of your daughter, you're bringing all these years of experience of that connection unmediated to that picture. So I'm interested in where the balance is with young children, if they have more mediated experience than they have direct experience, how that changes social interaction. Because all of these are recent. For all of us who are adults, we spent a good part of our childhoods without this intervention. You know what I'm trying to ask here? So I'm wondering if there's any research there's a tipping point, it seems to me, because I've certainly met young children who are antisocial in a way that I've never seen in all the years I've been educating children, because they are so used to having this kind of controlled interaction. The person on that side of the screen is not that unpredictable, because like you said, you can just ignore them. Do you know
Right,
what
and they're not contingent with you.
Right.
I think, that's a huge thing that is missing. There's the contingent interaction, but also we always tend to, we assume so wrongly that children understand what we understand, and there's studies showing that, they don't realize that that person in the Skype is the same person who they know. There's something called the video deficit, that young children really aren't mapping from video to world the way that we think that they are.
Right.
And they don't follow the plots in shows the way that we would expect them to, and so on.
Yeah, so I was relating in the same way to my friend Diane. I'm also an educator, but I teach high school students in the public schools. And in talking to my students about this, they're like the last ones that didn't grow up with these in their hands when they learned to read and write. And what I'm really curious about, which might be something more about, is what is it actually doing to the brain? And how is a 3-year-old's brain different than a 13-year-old's brain? I mean, not only lots of differences there, but in terms of what is this really doing to the brain? Because I see kids with a lot of information, and I see the ones that have a lot of information that have had true interactions, they're at a level like this. They're higher than any kids I've ever taught. And there's very few of them. But then there's a huge number that have a lot of information and no scaffolding for it. They have no real experience to put it into any sort of critical analysis. And I think that's related to your whole citation thing. They haven't read it. They can't dissect it. They can't analyze it. They can't simplify it. And so my sense is it's doing something to the brain that's related to the social interaction, and that's giving us a lot of information that's not going to be connected to a lot of useful, purposeful work. Kind of a lot there.
So the thing about young brains is that they adapt themselves to prevailing circumstances really reliably. No matter what the circumstances are, they'll try and smoke out what the necessary contingencies are and satisfy those contingencies. And that makes perfect sense, right? Kids that grow up in impoverished conditions, in high crime neighborhoods, learn to respond very quickly to events, to be suspicious of strangers, and that shows up in gray matter volumes in their brain when they're adults. And so it shapes the way that their brains respond. You grow up in a more affluent situation with lots of stimulation and educational experience, and you literally grow more hippocampus and prefrontal cortex in regions that allow you to increase self-control and put off rewards to more distant futures. This is just brains adapting again to prevailing circumstances. What I think we don't really understand is what the contingencies are with a lot of these devices. That isn't to say, again, I'm not asserting with that these devices are doing harm, but I don't think we really know everything that they're doing. You can speculate. If one of the things that they're doing is allowing for immediate feedback on everything, then that might sort of select for expecting immediate feedback, immediate stimulation feedback. If it is mediating the memorization of facts in the world, maybe not language or meaning or anything, but I don't know, but then your brains are lazy. Brains are lazy, right? If there's an opportunity for the brain to, maybe I shouldn't speak for other people. If there's an opportunity for the brain to outsource a bit of effort, it'll take it.
In the back, someone was waiting. So that,
Yeah, I had sort of a different question about virtues and vices, which is, I just recently been reading Alan Turing's correspondence and biographies. He talks at one point as he was, in England where he was being criminalized for his homosexuality and was beginning to program the code for, or theorize about what might be artificial intelligence and technologies of the future. One of the things he wrote about was the way that he hoped he couldn't wait, I guess in this case literally, for the time when we would be able to have some sort of a technology or interface with another sort of reality that showed us that we had no purchase on what is reality or even what is humanity, and that we might, it's actually, these things, these devices, what we have now might show us, what we could be or what we can become, and not so much be a copy of reality as maybe like a code that could envision some, Right, but I guess my question is there a way that you can speak of maybe the virtues of technology that have, and this is a really subjective question, but improved how we see our own humanity, or brought us to better realizations in some sort of global, threshold of the future and interacting with one another?
I actually, when you were talking a little bit earlier, I was thinking that I have a theory, supported by any brain science, that that a great deal of virtual interactions makes personal presence more valuable. Now, it doesn't mean that we'll inevitably choose that when we should, and maybe it's only for somebody in my age group, but I interact with people online all the time, and when I have the chance to see them in person, I will. I work some with museums and archives, and some of which are still very worried about, well, if we digitize all the paintings on the wall, if we digitize all the stuff in the archives, which you can't, because there's way more stuff in the archives than there are books. Books we could conceivably digitize, all of the published books, at some point. But we can't do that with archival materials. It's, people's file cabinets full of individual pieces of paper and stuff. If you could do that and put it all online, would people stop going to the museum, to the archives? And evidence that nobody reads, shows that in fact it's the opposite. That when you put, there's a million pictures of the Mona Lisa. You can see the Mona Lisa, right? You can see what the Mona Lisa looks like. You can zoom in on it digitally in a way that you couldn't when you're there. There are still lines out the door at the Louvre because people want to see it in person. It doesn't matter how many copies there are. It doesn't matter how often you digitize something or copy it. People still value personal presence.
Too, we've learned so much about other cultures, and I think so much social acceptance comes from what we've been able to get through these communication channels around the globe.
Well, and I think too, we know a little bit less about that from being here. I think one of the moral dimensions of the internet, which is often what we're accessing these devices, is sort of cultural colonization. The internet was invented in the US and is in many ways a very Anglophone, certainly, and US-centric thing. Certainly there's plenty of, stuff in other languages, stuff in other countries, but in general, we are a net exporter of the internet and all things on the internet. And even though it's possible to interact with people from other countries and another, we tend not to. Right? We tend to channel, you're talking to your Facebook friends who are in a state away, or a city away, or a cubicle away, more often. However, in those other countries and in those other places, they are net gluttons of the internet that we're producing, and even though there may be bad aspects to that, in that they're getting more of the same culture than they should, they want it.
Well, there's a lot of good in that.
There's
culture too.
Yeah, there's a lot of knowledge. I think Wikipedia is a really kind of fascinating example because, so Wikipedia is something like the 5th or 6th most traffic site on the internet. English Wikipedia is much larger than all of the other Wikipedias in other languages, but there are 283 other Wikipedias in other languages, and the Wikipedia Foundation does as much as it can to go around to other countries in those other languages and say, please write content about your own country in your own language. We want you to do that. We welcome that. So they're doing what they can to make it a more diverse environment.
Joe. This is sort of a paraphrasing and rephrasing of your point, but wouldn't it be cool if our technology made us less dependent on it instead of more dependent on it? It's kind of a question I think you have to be asking.
There are people,
Because
yeah.
our tools have come to serve aesthetic functions for us, and that even to the extent that they become habituated, they're always there. They're always within arm's length, and we trust that they will be there. We trust that when we flip the light switch, the power will come on, and that's fantastic. And it's fantastic that these are available to us, and that we've built them to augment our organic human capabilities, but wouldn't it be great if they actually trained us to be better humans? If they made us stronger without them. How do you do that?
Well, I submit it's an open question still, whether they're making us stronger or weaker. I mean, I think one thing, Angel's point about the hippocampus is undisputed.
Yeah.
Our hippocampus is not growing as robustly because we're using our GPS system. But on the other hand, I never get lost in it.
So who reads The Onion, right? It's America's favorite newspaper. So The Onion actually may be a bit older than you realize. It started in the 90s, before the web, really. And there's this Onion article that I always think of, which is hilarious. This satirical article that is all about how Aryan Man and Aryan Man's brother are having an argument about the capital of Australia. What's the capital of Australia? When there's an encyclopedia on the shelf next to them, and so they go back and is it Sydney, is it Canberra, no, you're wrong, no, you're wrong, you're wrong. And they don't look it up, is the whole joke about this article. You couldn't write that satirical article today because somebody would Google it, somebody would look it up on Wikipedia. And that's the tiniest example, but and that's the level of education that the internet is these tiny little things. Are Gwyneth Paltrow and Chris Martin really getting divorced? Oh, yes they are, okay. But we have these incremental, but large in the aggregate, greater bodies of knowledge.
There's another element to this I'd love to ask both of you about that we haven't really discussed as much, which is I think we still are talking a lot about content coming at us and consuming this stuff. But what about the interactive element? With libraries, with your daughter, but not only just communicating about how things are going, but sharing content, delivering Wikipedia, these kinds of things would be good. Do you think about, for example, the difference between consumption and interaction of media in children?
Well, when the shows are interactive, that's certainly better for children when they're doing things and they sort of wait for the child to respond, because you get that contingency then. So that is more positive. Where I thought you were going to go with that was this issue of deep thought versus these, lots of little snippets of content. So I suppose, deep relationships, deep connections that you sometimes can find through this by connecting to long lost, friends who perhaps, but it's so different from getting a letter in the mail that you absorb and stick with,
It is different, but it's also so much more frequent. We probably all in this room have 100 anecdotes per person, but I have reconnected with people from high school whom I loathed. Why on earth is this person? What possibly gave me the impression that I would want to hear from them ever? I would much rather be dead than hear from them. And but I open it up. We have a little interaction. I learn about his divorce. And we start talking about what it's like to have kids. Pretty soon, this guy is not such a, wow, this is a really human relationship I have with this person that I just wanted to fall under a trap when you're in high school. And it's a very different, all of a sudden my past is starting to subtly rewrite itself, it's like it's completely different. Yeah.
Well, back to what you were talking about with children, what would they be doing with their time otherwise? We say this with children, what would they be doing? Playing with a cardboard box, digesting their day, using their imagination. What would adults be doing? Why do we ask this question of children and not adults? What would we be doing? And even when we assume Skype is a wonderful thing to stay in touch with your grandparents or your grandmother, maybe we would be interacting with our parent. Maybe we would be joining the bowling league. There's a book, I think it's called Bowling in America.
Yeah,
Bowling Alone. And this other new book, Big Disconnect. Catherine, I can't remember her name. Big Disconnect. Does that ring a bell with anybody? It's just about the things that we would be doing if we weren't keeping up with the catty kids from junior high. Would we be taking a walk? Would we be planting in a tree? Would we be noticing something else in our environment that would add to our humanity in a more fulfilling spiritual way, is what I want to know.
So getting control over it. At UVA, there was a really, really wonderful day last week because the email for many of the faculty was broken all day and you got no incoming messages. And I just felt so good that night. But I've been trying really hard to only check email once a day because it fractions you. So it's not only that time, but it's what it's doing in terms of chopping up your time. But yes, there's, what else would children be doing besides playing, Candyland or whatever, some of those that don't necessarily have deep meaning for them, but they are good for hand-eye coordination.
Yes, please. One thing I want to make sure we do before we leave is I want to take your question, and I want to make sure we hear the voices of the college students and the younger people in the room, because we wanted this to be kind of cross-generational, but I want to take your question first, please.
Thank you. My name is Lisa. I'm also a Lillard from the childhood educator and and I guess all of this is really fascinating, and there's so many different facets to the topic that one could, pursue. But probably the piece of it that feels the most compelling for me is the question of what impact all of these devices and all of this technology is having on our sense of humanity. So, as Waldorf educators, one of the things that we are given to ponder is the notion that every child that comes into the world, every child that comes into life, has as its primary question, what does it mean to be human? And everything that they experience in the world is an answer to that question. So all of us, when we were young children, we had human interaction and real-time experience to answer that primal question. Children these days have so much less real-time human interaction to answer that question. So much more of their experience is virtual than real. And
But there are real people on the other side of those interactions. That world is a real world. There are, many games these days have, sort of a multiplayer thing. I've worked with friends. There are real people on the other end of those interactions that our devices enable us to connect to. I disagree, maybe not as strongly as some of my colleagues, but with the whole notion of dividing the world into the virtual and the real. Because the fact is that these devices are created by human beings. And understanding the human conditions in which those devices are created is a very important educational thing. Teaching children that they can interact with those devices is a very important thing. It's a huge political issue whether or not you're allowed to if you know how, make that device do something it wasn't designed to do, right? Which is a very powerful interaction. Maybe not for, you know, 8-year-old. But I mean, a lot of it, there's a book, Stephen Levy wrote a book, which I cannot remember the name of. But he wrote a book basically about video games and about the common perception that, you know, kids are playing too many video games. And I think this is before the rise of mobile computing. But he was pointing out that when children are playing video games, they look, you know, as though their brain has been left 2 miles behind. They look like this. But he was pointing out that the reason they look like that is that they are completely engaged with whatever is on the screen. That their brain activity is actually much higher. So I think that the experiences that we're having through these devices are experiences. They are real experiences, often with real people interacting with things that we're doing.
But they are, I agree with you, but they are, there's a different quality to those experiences. And my question is, 20, 30, 50 years down the line, are we going to be able to really perceive that our sense of humanity has shifted as a result of this?
Very possible. Yeah. So I know I'm putting some of my students and others in the room on the spot here, but I know in the discussions we've had, they've been on very different topics than the ones that we're talking about so far. And so I don't know if any of them would be willing to mention some of those and some things that all of you feel concerned about or think quite a lot about.
Hi, I'm Sarah. I'm a fourth-year media studies student, so we talk about this stuff in class a lot. My concern is that I feel like there were good reasons to develop this technology in the first place. Like I do research on telemedicine, and obviously, you know, like in-person doctor visits are better, but there are situations where, you know, they can't drive 6 hours to VA hospitals to get the care, and it's just, you know, telemedicine is better than nothing. And there are a lot of studies show that those are as good of a medical care as the regular care. And also, like, Twitter revolution. I know, like, the title is kind of controversial because, you know, does it actually, like, social media kind of stuff, does it actually translate into, like, a real, you know, active, like, work? But I think kids are being more aware of, like, the world, and I think there's more, like, there's a reason why those technologies continue to, like, develop in our world, and that there's a lot of good that can come out of it. Even, like, in terms of, like, understanding humanity, I took a course called The Wire, where we studied the show, The Wire, the HBO show called The Wire, and I learned a lot more about how inner cities become, you know, the way they are all through, like, government policies and the school systems and whatever violence and everything else that comes together through a TV show, through watching, like, through sympathy and, like, getting closer to the character, more so than I would have if I read a book. So I don't know, like, just wanted to add that there are things.
That's interesting. So one research bit there is people think that they get more out of watching a video than reading a book, but actually the research shows that they don't, that they get more out of reading. And in some of the research in my lab, we try to replicate those Bandura studies where the person's kicking the bobo doll up in the air and punching it in the nose and all with children today, but we also had them read a book about somebody doing these terrible things to the bobo doll, and we also had them pretend play it, and then we had children who just went and saw the bobo doll for the first time without any pre-event. And we got almost 100% imitation from the narrative, but no more than in the control group and the children who had watched it on television or pretended it, suggesting that narratives are a particularly strong way to control things out. And children who read more novels have more advanced theory of mind than children who are reading more factual books, same with adults. So I think there is a lot to narrative, and it's probably because you're needing to do that much more cognitive work in the processing than when you're provided everything.
Yeah. I mean, I'm aware of other evidence of that as well. I think I've never seen it go the opposite direction, although, you know, there again, it's a matter of the goal. The reason that it works this way is because when you have to do the translation yourself, when you're translating from symbols, you have to do more work. It's all about work. It's all about how much work your brain has to do. The more work your brain has to do, the more your brain's going to adapt to having to do more work. Because you want to, by any route possible, make it easier. And adapting is making it easier. So you grow your brain in certain kinds of ways. But it may be, like me and my GPS, I don't want to do more work. I don't want to. I got other work I want to do. I want to do other work. So I choose the thing that I know is going to make me do less work. So I have my little thing squawking at me, turn left now. So I don't have to remember Washington, D.C. because it seems impossible. So you know, it's really, I think, so somebody mentioned, you know, it's sort of how, we're in kind of a broad social growing process. You know, we need to know how and when and why to use these things that really do make life easier in important ways.
I think within the next 50 years, we'll be having these debates about implanted computers. So we should be grateful about the fact that the devices are still largely separate from us, even when they're in the form of glasses.
I guess I would argue that sometimes we have to do a lot more work just to create the human experience that we have like naturally, because you know devices are limited. They only allow you to do certain things that they've been designed to do. Oh, sorry, I'm a computer science major, so like I kind of make the things and I see like what we like are like allow people to be capable of doing, and it's just a lot more work to like emulate that, I guess. But like I see like what you guys are saying is like, you know, it amplifies who we are already. It's only what the designers have, you know, allowed to amplify. So what if we don't like what's being amplified? Like, you know, they didn't like that the books were coming about, but books are going to be there forever. This technology is probably going to be around for a while or something like it. So how do you deal with it if you don't like what is like we're limited in being pushed towards?
Like, about an example, social media, or what would you pick as an example of that?
I guess like mobile phones, I guess, or devices, like just that accessibility all the time. Like, yeah, I guess.
So you're feeling uncomfortable that it's always there, and you could easily just try it.
Yeah, like if someone doesn't want to share something with their friend, but it's like all shared.
Well, I think people who study computer science and design have a much stronger sense, or even people who just sort of follow tech news, have a much stronger sense of the devices as created by people. I think that often Arthur C. Clarke once said, you know, that any sufficiently advanced technology becomes indistinguishable from magic. And I think that a lot of us have a sort of a magical relationship to our devices, you know, if we're not sufficiently cognizant of what you said, which is that the device will only allow us to do particular things that it is designed to do. And that design could be otherwise, which I think is the important thing to realize. And you don't have to learn to design mobile phones or to know everything about how they work, you know, to understand that contingency. And I think it's really, really important to understand that your phone or whatever device is letting you do certain things because it is designed that way. And it doesn't have to be designed that way. You know, we're talking about, you know, like phones and accidents. You know, why isn't there a car mode for phones where you just kind of go like that and the whole thing is, you know, completely off for
the phone screen.
Yeah, the phone screen. You know, this needs to be off for the next half an hour, you know, and then it will magically open up again. You know, there are ways around like all the problems with the device. So I don't know if that's answering your question, but like what you started with. So
we got Max and then Megan and.
So I'm a PhD student in music composition. Everything we've talked about has been visual. Watching TV is visual. Reading a book is visual. But what about auditory? Like reading a book, a lot of people are in a quiet environment, opposed to watching TV. You can't really watch it quiet. It's not the same experience. how does sound affect the brain or little kids in paying attention or isolating themselves or doing both at the same time? If they're watching TV with a friend, opposed to, you can't really read a book with a friend. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So how does sound influence disconnect or connect in devices?
That's it. One thing I was just saying on that, because I was thinking of it earlier with high school students, there's the plug in, and you're talking, and the class is going on, and you're like, is that on? Because for some kids it is, and some kids can multitask like that, and some kids it calms them down, but for the most part at that level, it's not helping them learn.
Right.
So it's a really interesting question though, because it's so important, especially at that age, to have that identifying factor when using.
I got stuck in an airport recently, delays. I thought I was going crazy. So you're tired already, but you're hearing everybody's conversation, and then the announcements up there. And I was trying to read a book, and I don't know if it's my age or what, but I just could not find any peace. I just wanted peace.
Yeah, it's
And
actually,
that's where
there's something about the way that we're
that's the
designed.
only place you can do it.
Yeah, if you heard the whole conversation in the background, it turns out that will not drag your attention away, like hearing only one half of the conversation. I'm not really sure what it is, but that's been documented. You're trying to, it's like this, it's something called the Zeigarnik effect. It's like when you don't hear the end of the song, you want to go and finish the song.
But the world is maddening sometimes now because of electronic devices. In the grocery store, people are talking in your corner, hello? I am caught off guard continually because of electronic gadgets now.
Yeah. I have a lot of my meetings while I walk to work. And here's the thing, right? So a lot of media will have you make you be more sedentary, but I discovered a way to fill in some time. I now can have a meeting while walking to work, and it takes about a half an hour to walk to work, and I can get a little meeting in there. And it's not like I'm ruining my walk. I'm having an awesome time because sometimes it's with friends, sometimes it's my parents, sometimes it's someone at school. But I look pretty goofy walking down the street with this little thing hanging on my ear, going, But I don't think that addresses your question. I mean, when I think about sound, I think about it like any other kind of content. I don't really think about it as a new medium. And it's like it's a new method of getting to that.
Well, I mean, it's pollutant, I think. But that's, I remember when there were not, I don't have TV, I watch video, but I am old enough to remember when there were not monitors everywhere. And there are monitors everywhere. Every, bar, every library, and often they're showing good information, but, and often they'll, have the sound turned off but yeah, I think it's, maybe the psychologist can answer, is sound more distracting and more annoying than visual? Like, is it harder to block out certain sounds and certain, images? Whether or not that's true, it's certainly true that the headphones solve that problem if they are, which you can't really do anything with visually except, sunglasses. So I was just, this is not super relevant, but we were talking earlier about the fact that Amazon owns Audible.com, audiobooks. So I used to get a little freaked out when I said I just read such and such when I had just listened to the audiobook. Was that really reading? And I've gotten over it and I've decided it's reading, even though it's auditory. But it is nice about listening to those things that you can do other things at the same time, whereas I can't really while I'm reading a book. At the same time, it's a subtly different experience. And I was just mentioning earlier that Amazon now offers this thing it calls immersive reading, which is where you read the book and listen to the audio version, the professionally narrated audio version of that book at the same time, which sounds like the ninth circle of hell to me. I'm gonna have to try it out. Yeah, one or the other, but it sounds awful. And I was like, really? Partly because I think I read a lot faster than I listen. I read really So I don't know if that answers your question, but it's probably a really interesting question for research, like the extent to which there's more sound pollution, because I would hypothesize that there is, and the extent to which even the ability to block that out with headphones is affecting us in ways.
Yeah, but sound pollution is so, I traveled to Japan in the 80s, and I remember walking down the street in Tokyo, and I was like, oh, it kept me to my hotel, because it was like, you know, there's like lots of sounds and noises, and you walk past a little shop, and it's, you know, and you know, that was 1987, and I thought I was going to go crazy. There was certain internet. I just wasn't used to it.
So did we have maybe a couple more questions, and then we can continue with the discussion informally?
So I'd like to comment a little bit about the talk we were having a little bit before about video games. When I was growing up in high school, I didn't have a whole lot of homework when I came home because I finished it all while I was there. And naturally, you know, I went around. I did try to go around and try to cut grass for the other, you know, houses in the neighborhood and around in the area, but found that there weren't any yards that needed to be cut except for one. So I did cut that yard. But had a lot of free time. And because of the way, you know, suburbia is kind of set up, I didn't have a whole lot of kids around in my neighborhood that I could really interact with. And so I turned to the next best thing, which was video games. And I played a lot of video games. I mean, I'd be at school, do all my homework, and you know, I did really well there. I'd do sports, and I would come home, I'd have dinner, and I'd play video games for the rest of the night because you know, I didn't have anything better to do. And I can appreciate, you know, that there are nice aspects about video games. There are certain things in terms of, you know, getting better reaction time. That's been proven, I think, with some of the first-person shooters. That's great. I think that's wonderful. And some of the other ones in terms of just getting an interaction, entertainment factor. You have to look at that as well. I think what's alarming to me in that instance is the quantity or the amount of time that I spent playing video games as a young child. I mean, I love to read. I did read from time to time, but that was concerning, and especially as we move into a more and more digital age. When are we going to put the brakes on in terms of for all this content and entertainment? And moving along with that, with what you were talking about ebooks, one thing I particularly like about ebooks is there's a new app being developed called Spritz. I don't know if you're familiar with it. Mac and I have talked about this a little bit. I'm a biomedical engineering student, by the way. And Spritz is really neat because what it is, it's a reading, I guess, a speed reading device. So what it does is it flashes words in front of you, and it isolates and then you're focusing on one point, and it'll move the words around. And there's just the way the psychology of reading works is you'll be reading a word, once you get to a certain point, your brain knows what the word is. And it's like a subconscious thing. And what Spritz does is it just lines it up perfectly for you. And you can crank through with 600 words per minute, 1,000 words per minute, and retain all the information. It's wonderful. There's a few different, you guys should go home and look it up. It's really, really neat. It doesn't work great for everything. I found, you know, when I'm reading scientific articles with that, the citations kind of throw me off a little bit when I'm going at 600 words per minute, but it's very efficient. And I think the whole idea of a book is more of conveying knowledge and conveying this information. It's not necessarily the book itself. I mean, there's a time for pleasure of reading, and I love that. You know, I still sit back and, you know, crack open Dracula or, you know, some literary work, and I love that. But when I'm looking through scientific articles, I'm much more efficient if I can speed read through at 6,000 or 1,000 words per minute, get the information I need, and move on. And so I love like what you're saying in terms of it's saving energy for me. I'm spending less time, it's more efficient. I think that's really cool. And in the grand scheme of things, I know I'm talking about a lot, but in the grand scheme of things, I'd really like to know your opinions on, in the future, do you see us as a society ever taking individual technologies like the Spritz, for an example, and saying, you know, is this good? Is this bad? Where does this fit in? How should we use this as a culture? Or do you see that largely remaining an individual, I guess, endeavor for that? Because I know that the Amish do that with all the technologies. They don't adopt a lot, which I don't know what that says, but something like that I think would be very neat as an engineer who creates these kinds of things. It is very important to me to do my work. Yeah.
So one question I have in response is, I wonder how many people, if you ask them if they felt like there was something they did in their teenage years that was a terrible waste of time, and they wish they'd used their time in a better way, I think most of us would raise our hands. And so, you know, what might have geared you towards something else?
that's a difficult thing in terms of I don't know what my teenage self would have said. I probably enjoyed playing video games. But I mean,
Well,
looking back,
I thought you sort of answered that in a way when you, in your initial remarks, when you said your environment was boring. Like that you're in the suburbs and there just isn't that much to do. I read a fantastic article in a recent issue of The Atlantic, which was about how children, and especially children, are overprotected these days. And it was, I don't know, maybe some of you did, and they showed this picture of this playground in the UK that had basically a pile of old tires and some filthy ripped couches and like a stream, and they were allowed to light fires and stuff. And they could, I know, and we laughed because that's so not our model of childhood. But then they, they historicized it with this guy who had done research on childhood in the 70s. And I remember, I was a kid in the 70s. Yeah, we would wander around the neighborhood. We were allowed to do that. You find a little scrub patch and you build yourself a fort with the sticks. And that's sure because we didn't have all the digital media. But maybe, I don't know whether it's because of the rise of the digital media or there's some kind of connection. But kids these days are under constant adult supervision. Yes. And they're in, and yes, except for the Waldorf and Montessori, I mean, God bless you for giving them like stimulating environments. I mean, so, I think that a lot of people are probably turning to the digital media because their actual environment is.
Yeah, that, in terms of kids these days or our current culture, that would be my first nomination for not the best cultural term for the devices per se. It's the running away from what Michael Chabon has called the wilderness of childhood.
I looked at that playground with the pile of tires and I wanted to go to there. That looks like fires.
My favorite childhood place was a place we called the Sand Pits. And it was literally a bunch of sand pits. It was aptly named.
My brothers used to set models on fire, firecrackers and apples. We had a Rabel in the backyard. It was called California. We were in Ohio. We called it California. Because to us, a little bit of unlandscaped land with no fences between property was freedom, and we all played until dark. And there weren't children, 11 and 12-year-olds now have cell phones, and parents tell me it's for their safety. It's for their safety. But it's a monitoring device, and it leads to a false sense of safety. And then the children go. There's an example in that free-range parenting book where the woman, America's worst mother, this lady who wrote an article in the New York Sun or something about how she let her 8-year-old ride the subway at them. And she was kind of vilified in the media quickly. And she gave an example where he calls her on the phone and says, "Mom, can I have banana bread for breakfast?" And he's 10. And it's just like, oh, you guys, go crazy, have banana bread. Why are you calling me and why am I answering this? Because our children are now asking us questions where they would have taken their initiative and the risk and made the decision. So there's a dependency with at least child rearing between children, phones, and parents, and amping up the anxiety that's pretty useless according to crime statistic data.
And this is why, of course, all of us who grew up in the 60s and 70s turned out so stable and secure.
But you weren't abducted, were you?
But I think the other difference that we have pointed to is that, and this is for adults as well as children, is the expectation that we're going to be entertained all the time we're awake. Children now expect to be entertained. That tire patch was a creation. They're creating something. They're not sitting there consuming.
Oh, yeah.
And we're all consuming, don't you think?
I don't know. I was a crazy reader kid.
Right.
I was one of these crazy reader kids, the kind of kid that concerned the parents because I would not stop reading, and I wanted to read all the time. I wanted to read everywhere. Didn't matter what I was doing or whether it was appropriate. I wanted to read the dinner table. I wanted to talk to people because they were boring. I wanted to read my book. And I don't
read
know.
through classes.
Maybe.
I read all through my science classes.
Yeah. I was a miserable student because I was reading.
Well, the trick about that is that no teacher will fail you for reading in class. Actually one teacher would, but
What happens is you will pass the test because you can read. And you have thought, and you can analyze it, you can synthesize, so you get the question, you figure it out, and you answer it. And the kid who's not doing any of that is listening and hearing all these facts and looking all this stuff up, and they can't connect it in any way. They get the questions, they don't even know what the question is. And so then we sit here, well, part of what I feel is like we were here, who are we in this room? we are like this sliver of society who are sitting here having a discussion. And there are huge numbers of people and kids going up. They're going to have a discussion in their world, and there's no one monitoring whether their phone is on or not. And so we look at this is a big experiment. And what is going to be?
Well, is it a class issue
We
as
can't
well?
put the genie back in the bottle. And so it's not like you can say, oh, we'll limit. I lived in Norway for a period of time. I can imagine the Norwegians having a societal discussion and saying, we will not allow, they do, they say, these movies will not be shown in our theaters. You're like, they do that. That's not going to happen here.
Okay. Maybe last question?
Oh, do you have time for me to ask it?
Sure, last question.
This is really related to what we just talked about recently, but just to throw an idea out that we were talking a lot about in class is social identity with social media. So I know a lot of us, a lot of young people that have their devices on them all the time, and a big aspect of that is, you know, most people have 2, 3, 4 social media platforms that are constantly updating you. And what kind of strikes me about that is not only, you know, digital interaction, but kind of this culture of likes. So the idea, you don't just share content, but you immediately receive all this feedback about it, whether it's wanted or not. And my question is like, how is that integrated, or how is that overwhelming, and how does that affect like our formation of self, or confidence, even like mental health, really? If you've heard of like Facebook depression, it sounds funny, but it's kind of, it's like a real phenomenon. So I guess that's kind of like an issue that we think about more so, or we've grown up with.
Maybe then I can plug
Yes, please.
a moment, because I'm offering a class just about exactly what you just talked about in the fall. So you should take it. Or maybe all 4 years.
What's the title and who
It's called Electronic Identity. Engineering and dance. So it's taught, I'm a professor in systems, and it's taught by the head of the dance department. We're going to talk about movement. It's going to be movement and technology and identity.
Oh, that sounds excellent.
So you should take it.
Tell us your
I'm Amy.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, good. Okay, I want to thank, I think we probably better wrap it up, and if people are still interested in conversation, if Matthew allows, we can probably stay for a little bit and talk. But I just want to thank our panelists, thanks so much for coming. Thank everyone else for coming.
I have it next to my
That's what I did. Yeah. What did you do?